Great. I squeezed my eyes tightly as I felt the last strings of sleep slowly vanish. I slowly opened my eyes to be greeted by light. My God, I groaned, who the hell created light? I mumbled as I climbed out of bed. I stomped over to the curtains and pulled them shut with brutal force. I definitely woke up on the wrong side of the bed. With slug-like movements, I all but dragged myself to the en suite. I got undressed while groaning, my body begging me to go back to bed. After a short shower, I wore on a pair of faded jeans and one of my favorite hoods. Running my hand over my tangled hair, I sighed and decided to tie it up. Slipping on my tennis shoes, I walked towards the door and put my hand on the knob, ready to open it. I froze for a second and glanced at my bed. My comfortable, warm, fuzzy little bed. Not being able to help myself, I all but sprinted to my bed and leaped off the ground, landing on the soft material. I sighed in content and closed my eyes as I lay on my back. I feel like I'm forgetting something. My eyes popped open and I racked my memory to see what it was I was forgetting. It felt as if a bucket of ice water was thrown at me. Suddenly, what I was forgetting popped up into my mind and I gasped at the realization. We were going to meet up with Adrian. I ran for the door and threw it open. Running down the hallways, I headed towards Tate's office and banged on the door loudly. "Tate," I yelled. When no answer came, I rolled my eyes and pushed the door open. Stumbling in, I looked around the room and abruptly stopped as I glanced around the area. No one was in sight. Tate wasn't in his usual spot and papers were neatly stacked on his desk. Untouched, my mouth was open, ready to yell his name. But when no one was in sight, I shut my mouth and stood up straight. I narrowed my eyes as I glanced at the clock hanging up on the wall. "Tate," I sneered as my eyes didn't leave the clock. "You better not have left without me." With a little growl, I spun around and raced out of Tate's office and the building itself. I saw the forest in the distance and pushed myself further, the green trees passing me in a blur. I followed the route from yesterday and saw the familiar tall trees and made out hushed voices. Much to my dismay, I spotted Tate and Colin talking to one another, while Dale and Tom glanced around the area repeatedly. "Alpha, you say it's a trap, yet we are here," Tom exclaimed, and my steps slowed as I neared. "Yes, I did, but I'm not going to sit and wait around for him to make his move," Tate replied in a voice like stone. "You know, maybe the note was left for someone else," Dale mumbled, leaning on a tree as he huffed, looking bored. Everyone decided to ignore him and stay put in silence. I fumed in rage and stomped forward towards them, and that made all their heads snap to mine. "If it isn't our favorite bundle of joy," Colin cheered as he gave me a huge grin. I ignored Colin and marched up to Tate. I was in no mood for fun and games. "Alina, what are you doing here?" Tate said through gritted teeth. I looked at him through narrow eyes and faced him. Feeling equally mad, "I could ask you the same thing," I said, crossing my arms over my chest as I looked at him with a frown. "It's dangerous here," Tate growled lowly as he grabbed my arm. "Go back now," he said, gently shoving me backwards. "No," I bellowed in anger. He expected me to leave. Who was the elemental here? If anything, I should be telling him to leave. Tate, however, didn't like my answer. He growled loudly in an inhuman way. I jumped back in fright. Before Tate could open his mouth, Colin jumped in and placed a hand on Tate's shoulder. "Calm down, big boy. If she wants to stay, she can stay," Colin said with a shrug. Tate snapped his head to Colin's and shrugged his uncle's arm off. "So she could get hurt, put in danger. Of all people, you should know how I feel," Tate said the last part in a low voice as he stared at his uncle. I knew what he was referring to. Colin's wife had been killed because she wasn't put out of danger's way. "No, Colin, don't listen to him. Stay strong." "Alina, I think you should go back to the committee," Colin mumbled quietly. I opened my mouth to protest, but Tom nodded his head in agreement. "I think you should too," Tom said as politely as he could as he looked at me like I was about to explode. "He wasn't too far off, Dale. Take your Luna back," Tate commanded, avoiding eye contact with me. "What?" Dale gasped, pointing to himself. "And miss all the action? No way." He scowled like a child as he crossed his arms. "Then it's settled," I said smugly as I looked at Dale with a wide smile. "Dale," Tate growled in warning. Alpha." Tom said suddenly as he pushed himself off of the tree and stood up straight. I think it might be a little too late for that, he said in an uneasy tone, hearing steps approaching. My gaze followed everyone else's. A lone figure strode out from the trees and towards us. Tate pushed me behind him, and in all honesty, I didn't mind hiding behind his back. So I was a little afraid. So what? Would you look at that, said a male voice. In humor as the figure approached us. Oh no. Why did that voice sound familiar? It's a full house over here, the person cheered. Too bad I came alone. The silhouette finally stood before us and my jaw dropped open so widely. I wouldn't be surprised if it fell onto the floor. Are you kidding me? Tom mumbled as he looked at the boy in irritation. Wait, who's this again? Dale asked as he looked at us with an eyebrow raised. This, I said dryly, is Ryan the fire elemental. I thought he was dead. Dale said in confusion as he glanced at Ryan and back to me. So did we, Dale? So did we? Why aren't you dead? Tate said gruffly as he tightened his hold on me and held me close to his side. Ryan laughed loudly and lifted his hand, letting flames spark at the tip of his fingers. I guess death wasn't ready for me just yet. Ryan said with a large smile, allow me to explain. He said with a grin as he leaned on a tree playing with the fire on his fingertips. Great, I muttered, story time chat. Ryan took his sweet time as he played with the flames on his fingertips. I glanced at Tate to see that he had his jaw clenched and his fists were also clenched tightly. Are you going to explain or just stand there? Tate asked, unclenching his jaw, only to tense it back up. Why did I find that attractive? Are you being rude? Ryan said as he clicked his tongue to the roof of his mouth. I would hate to burn a limb or two. I narrowed my eyes at Ryan and took a step forward, only to have Tate's arm quickly wrap around my waist to hold me back. That, I said gruffly as I shot Tate a look. Won't be so easy. Ryan stopped his glaring at Colin, who smirked, and turned to stare at me. Ah yes, the other elemental. Stealing my spotlight, aren't you? Ryan stated with a chuckle, but it sounded fake. Spotlight? You doing this for fame, boy? Some childhood dream? Colin mused as his smile widened each time he said a word. Ryan's face got red and he looked at Colin with dark eyes. When he stayed quiet, I was about to question his motives. But suddenly he lifted his hand and struck out to Colin. His hand that flickered out would have seemed harmless if it wasn't the hiss of pain seeping through Colin's lips. He clutched his abdomen and glared up at Ryan. Cheap move, boy. Before Ryan could answer, Tom took a threatening step towards Ryan and Tate let go of me to tower over Ryan, who blankly stared up at him. Look here, if you want trouble, just say so. If you want to walk away with your head attached to your body, stay. Tate said in a calm, low voice as he didn't even blink. Ryan raised his hands in between them and smirked widely. Tate didn't waver. Dale looked at Tate in concern as he eyed up Ryan, before walking over to stand near his brother, his hand firmly placed on Tate's shoulder. Tate didn't shrug it off, and the little show of affection was enough for Tate to understand. I'm here for you, brother. Aren't you at least the least bit curious as to how I am alive? Ryan taunted, and Tate stayed silent. I'll take that as a yes. Well, you see, I am a fire elemental, Ryan said, glancing at us, as if to see if we were processing. Meaning fire does me no harm. Ryan stopped at that. As for us, we all glanced at each other, and the realization was like a slap in the face. The fire healed him, helped him even. Tate turned away from Ryan and glanced down, muttering a string of curse words. Ryan looked at Tate in amusement, and I was itching to get rid of it. So what now? Do you have some genius plan? I said with a fake cheery voice. Please do tell. No, I don't have a genius plan. Adrian is gone, and burning down the werewolf committee isn't one of my top priorities now. Ryan bellowed and didn't continue. We all were curious, and hell, he knew it. Tom was the first one to crack as he looked at Ryan with a raised eyebrow, keeping his distance. So what is then? Tom asked, the curiosity leaking into his voice. I'm glad you asked. Ryan cheered. Though I can't tell you that. The only reason I didn't drown him right there was because we were trying to avoid a fight. The last thing we needed was more blood on our hands. This was a great chat and all, but duty calls. With just that simple term, Ryan gave us one last smile as he disappeared. In a second, the rest of us stayed silent. I peeked a glance at everyone who stared at Tate, whom looked at the ground in deep thought. So I said awkwardly, "Anyone has a clue on what he plans on doing?" I asked as I glanced around at everyone. "No. But I mean, you could always drown him, right?" Dale asked with a small smile and couldn't help the wide grin that spread across my face as Colin chuckled. "Right," I agreed with a wide smile. I glanced at Tate and caught the little twitch of his lips. I felt better instantly and I pulled him towards me. I wrapped my arms around him and smiled up at him. Hazel eyes bore into mine and I felt like melting. "Hey, you know, everything's gonna work out, right?" I said in a low whisper as the others gave us privacy by slowly leaving. "Shouldn't I be saying that?" Tate said in a low murmur. He was frowning and that made me frown. I grabbed his shoulders and leaned up to press my lips against his. I gave his lips a small kiss and looked up at him. Tate leaned in and pressed his lips harder to mine and pulled me incredibly closer. Leaning back, only for a moment, I glanced down at his mouth and was more than happy to see the small smile that graced his lips. Hybrid. The silky sheets tangled around my legs and I squeezed my eyes shut, furiously rubbing them. I pouted, opening my eyes, and looked out the window. The moon's light shone through my window and dimly lit up my room. "Why can't you sleep?" I hissed, speaking to myself. I rubbed my forehead and irritation spread through my veins. My mind was like a broken record, repeating several thoughts over and over again. I couldn't seem to find a switch that could shut it all off. "You know what?" I whispered to myself as my voice lingered in the dark room. I give up with a dramatic sigh. I threw the silky sheets off of my body and stood up. My bare feet slapped onto the floorboards as I groggily walked over to my door, slipping on a pair of sandals. I grabbed my robe and wrapped it around my body. I opened my door and it squeaked loudly, making me cringe. The hallway was oddly quiet. It was pitch black and a little spark of fear ran down my spine. I rolled my eyes at the irony man up Alina. "You forget you're a werewolf," with that thought. My eyes immediately adjusted to the darkness and the hallway lit up in a strange color. It were as if I was wearing night goggles. I quietly walked down the hall. Where was I going? I had no idea. It was until I arrived in front of Tate's office that I came to a halt. Just looking at the door, I felt weird tingles dance around my body. Suddenly, I had the strong urge to see Tate. My body yearned for him and I couldn't ignore it anymore. But where was his room? I had no idea. It was way past midnight and everyone was asleep, except warrior wolves that guarded the borders. Of course, that left no one to ask. I doubted he was in his office at this hour, but hey, there was no harm in trying. I slowly turned the doorknob and entered the dark office. The tall glass windows allowed the luminescence of the moon to flood into the room. To my disappointment, my assumption was right. The office was untouched and nothing seemed out of place. I glanced around the books that stacked the walls and sighed in dismay. Just as I was about to close the door, something caught my eye. The usual accuracy of the bookshelves weren't present, and the brown frame of the bookshelf in the far corner was pushed slightly forward. Curiosity made my eyebrows raise as I walked over to the shelf in the far left-hand corner, behind Tate's desk. My fingers clasped around the frame and tugged it forward. When I was certain nothing was going to move, I was pushed back and I landed roughly on my rear, a small oomph leaving my lips groaning. I glanced up and was greeted by an open door. The bookshelf was outlined into a door shape and darkness was beyond it. With slow movements, I stood up and glanced inside. Curiosity got the best of me and I advanced inside. Was this Tate's chambers? His chambers indeed. I was greeted by a staircase that led underground. As I kept going forward, I entered a wide-looking room that had stone as walls. Candles were lit on a vanity and a round bed with black sheets made of silk was draped over a muscular body. Judging from the pull I felt, I knew it was Tate. The candles flickered and I couldn't help it. As I walked near him, his top half was bare and his dark hair was covering his eyes as soft snores escaped his lips. I stood there hypnotized for a second as my eyes skimmed over Tate. His broad shoulders were muscular and his bare chest rose with each breath. Gosh, I felt like a stalker. With that thought, I felt a little guilty. I was invading his private space and who was I to just waltz in? His mate, A small voice whispered in the back of my mind. After an internal battle in my head, I sighed and walked over to the bed. As much of a creep I felt. I wanted to be close to Tate. I slowly lifted the black sheets and slipped in beside Tate. After taking my sandals off, he had his back to me and I awkwardly placed my head onto the pillow beside his. Immediately my body adjusted to the bed and I almost moaned at the softness it provided. I also turned my back to Tate and faced the opposite direction. "Alina, why are you doing this again?" I questioned myself as my eyes starting to drop. I felt the heat of Tate's body, and knowing he was close, I was able to slip into a peaceful sleep within seconds. Though, before I fell asleep, I lightly muttered to myself, "You're a creep, Alina." First, my senses awoke before I did. I felt warm fingers caress my cheek, and a cloud of both warmness and comfort pressing into me from behind. Hot breath fanned the back of my neck, and unconsciously I pressed myself further into the body. I furrowed my eyebrows, and slowly my eyes managed to flutter open. I was facing a staircase, and immediately I remembered where I was, fully aware of the fingers caressing my cheek. I rotated my body to face Tate, who rested on his side, his head on a propped-up elbow. "What are you doing?" I managed to mutter as I leaned further into his palm, the tingles making me slightly shiver. "What I would like to know is, what are you doing in my bed?" Tate asked in a husky tone as his dark hazel eyes bore into mine. "I couldn't sleep," I replied lamely. "Ever since when did I get nervous?" My feeling for Tate were progressing and I knew it. "I'm not complaining," Tate said with a small smile. My heart skipped a beat and I returned his smile. We stayed silent for a moment and I began to feel awkward. "How did you get here anyway?" Tate asked as he tilted head gazing at me. I walked. I bit out, lost in his eyes. Tate rolled his eyes and gave me a small grin. "I know that I mean, how did you find my chamber?" he asked, and I was snapped out of my daze. "I have my ways," I said with a smirk, and Tate's grin widened, though he chose to stay silent. After a few moments, I placed a soft kiss on Tate's cheek and rushed to get out of there. Tate said I should simply lay with him for a while longer, but I made up an excuse and left. I certainly hope he didn't think I was a freak. I rushed back to my room and grabbed the nearest comb. Brushing down my bed hair, I got dressed in appropriate attire and was ready to leave the room once again. The sound of ringing made me freeze as I glanced at a phone on my bedside. It was ringing, and that most definitely wasn't my phone. Cautiously walking over, I picked up the old-looking thing and hesitantly spoke into the receiver. "Hello, hello, fellow elemental." The unmistakable voice of Ryan, the fire elemental, spoke, and I gritted my teeth. Did people not get a hint? "I want you to meet with me," he said coolly, and I glanced at the phone in disbelief. "Sure, why don't we have a bloody tea party?" I hissed into the phone angrily. "Great idea. But maybe another time. He'll be across the lake waiting. Come now alone." Ryan all but demanded. He must be delusional. To think I would go to meet with him, ha, the irony. "Now why would I do that?" I said sweetly. "What's the matter, scared? You can't come alone and defeat me." Ryan cooed into the phone and my hands tightened around the phone. "Afraid I'll turn you into ash? Tell me, which is it?" Ryan continued in a mocking voice, and I squeezed my eyes shut. "I'm on my way." With that, I crumbled the phone in my fist and threw it to the floor. I ran out of the door and made my way out of the werewolf committee. I was stupid. I was stupid by not telling Tate where I was going, and I was even more stupid to meet up with Ryan. But his words angered me. We both are elementals, and that gave both of us an equal change. He was fire and I was water. He couldn't harm me. I ran through the trees, the scenery passing in a green blur. The lake was a few kilometers ahead, and I pushed myself to go faster. Arriving at the lake, I glanced around and saw no one. I stepped on several rocks that crowded the lake and hopped off the last one, successfully making it to the other side of the lake. I looked up and was greeted by the familiar face of Ryan. I stayed silent and watched him with narrowed eyes. "Well?" I asked through gritted teeth. Ryan went straight to the point. No sugarcoating or beating around the bush. "You're coming with me," he simply said, and went to grab my arm. I jumped back and looked at him with wide eyes. Was he being serious? "What the hell are you on about?" I spat as I distanced myself from him. He said motioning between us is my newest priority. Ryan stated with a calm voice this. I asked, looking at him in a way that suggested he grew another head. What do you mean this why? To mate with me, of course. Ryan bellowed as he gave me a smirk. I looked at him completely frozen. I knew he was insane, but this look, I said slowly. I don't know which asylum you escaped from, but I suggest going back. I said in all seriousness. There is no time for jokes, I am taking you with me. Now, Ryan stated. He moved towards me, and on instinct I raised my palm, and immediately water slammed him in the chest. Making him hiss, that won't stop me, he gritted out. I will take you away and I will mate with you. You will bore my children and create hybrids for me. Ryan said, straightening up. His words made me falter. I dropped my hand and looked at him in shock. What are you talking about? I said in a deadly voice. You, me, fire and water, imagine the combination. The power of these children, Ryan ranted excitedly. There will be no children. I bellowed with a fierce glare. Yes, there will be. Hybrids will rule in the near future. He said with a grin, the same hybrids you will bear. Blood. I stared at Ryan for a full minute in complete and utter silence. Then I did what any sane person would do. I clutched my stomach, leaned over and started laughing at him. He sure as hell was funny. That's hilarious. I wheezed out as I fought to breath. After a few minutes, I wiped away the tears of laughter and focused my gaze on Ryan. Ryan stared at me blankly, and there was no trace of humor on his features. You're funny, but seriously, what do you want? I asked with an amused smile lingering on my lips. I already told you I want you to mate with me, Ryan said in complete seriousness, and the smile on my face vanished. Oh crap, he was serious. You really are insane. I muttered as I took a small step back. I would have shifted, but I came to realize I can't use my elemental powers whenever I'm in werewolf form. That was crossed off the list. Don't even think about it. Ryan hissed with narrowed eyes as I kept taking steps back. To run or to not run? I picked what anyone in my position would do. I spun around and ran as fast as I could. I was ready to jump over the rocks to cross the river. But suddenly, a wall of fire appeared in front of me and I gasped, jumping back. I quickly raised my hand and water shot out of my palm, making the flames sizzle loudly as it slowly vanished. I spun around and gave Ryan a death glare. He almost burnt me, you little bitch. I snapped as I angrily raised my palms and forcefully pushed forward. Ryan was shot hard in the chest with water, making him fly backwards and hit a tree. His breath hitched at the contact and he struggled to breathe for a few seconds. He stood up and walked forwards, stumbling slight as he lifted his finger and drew circle facing upwards. I watched him confused, but I was in a defense position ready for what was to happen next. Suddenly, flames erupted from the ground and circled around me. It rose up to my waist level and I stayed completely still, careful not to touch the flame. I can't hurt you as you are still needed though. I can always trap you. Ryan bellowed with a sadistic grin. I raised my palms once again and spun in a slow circle, extinguishing the fire around me. It's going to be harder than that, I muttered as I narrowed my eyes. Ryan sighed a dramatic sigh. He was still a healthy distance away from me, but he took a step forward. I didn't want to have to do this, but you leave me no choice. He sighed and raised his arms. I took a step back and stopped, as if I took another step back I'd fall into the lake. Ryan shot out his palms, and before I can react, 2 fireballs hit my palms and I gasped in shock. The pain hit seconds later and I screamed out in agony. The bastard burnt my hands. I couldn't help but sob as my hands throbbed in pain. There we go, Ryan said and came to pick me up. Before he could come near me, the ground beneath his feet started shaking violently. I looked up at him alarmed and glanced around to spot a man in the far corner of the trees. He looked middle-aged and harmless, but his palms were held out facing Ryan. Ryan stumbled to the ground and over again, struggling to get up. I remembered the pain and kneeled down by the lake. I gently placed my hands in the water and winced slightly. If fire healed Ryan, why shouldn't water heal me? Complete Percy Jackson moment. I couldn't help but think Alina. A desperate voice called out. My head shot up and spotted Tate on the other side of the lake. He glanced over at Ryan and then down at my hands. A growl left his lips and he started running over. I glanced down at my hands to see it was healed, and I gasped as they felt better than ever. Slowly standing up, I turned around to see Ryan had finally stood up, and his eyes were narrowed on the man that had began making his way to us. However, when I saw Ryan, I hissed in anger. I shot out my palm and motioned to the floor. Ryan was knocked over by the force of the water and was lying on the ground. Dripping wet, his eyes snapped back to mine. Before I could attack any further, I felt warm hands grab my shoulders and spin me around. I was pushed into a hard chest and I stumbled slightly. 𝐿𝐸 Tate whispered. He held me tightly and looked up at Ryan and at the man growling loudly. The man held up his hands in peace while Ryan shot out his palms. Tate pushed me to the ground and dodged the fireball as he growled at Ryan. "What are you doing here?" Tate said through gritted teeth. The man who controlled the ground rushed over and helped me up. To take 𝐿𝐸 over here, of course, so she can mate with me and give birth to my hybrids. Ryan said smugly. All of a sudden Tate froze. He stopped mid-growl and stared at Ryan in silence. His face must have been terrifying because Ryan took a step back. From behind, I saw Tate's body start to shake. "What the fuck did you just say?" Tate said in a mere whisper. His voice sounded dangerous and I almost gasped at his choice of words. "Tate never cussed. Why, you heard me." Ryan shot back, trying to sound bold. Tate let out a low chuckle. It had no humor in it. It was plain cold and full of venom. "I'm glad I did." With that, Tate transformed into his dark wolf in a split second. He lunged for Ryan, who was rooted to his spot in shock. Tate's large wolf towered over Ryan's body as Tate sunk his claws into Ryan's shoulders. "Get off!" Ryan screamed as blood pooled around Ryan's body. Ryan grabbed Tate's fur and clutched tightly. Tate growled and got of him in such speed. He was meters away from Ryan. I gasped as Tate's fur was burnt. It must have gone down to his skin because he growled uncontrollably. I raised my palm up to Tate and gently shot water at him, making his body and fur dripping wet, and he gave me a grateful nod. Tate shook his body, making the water shoot out. He went into an attack position, ready to lunge at Ryan, but the man near me moved forward. He raised his palm again, and suddenly the grass grew unnaturally long and thick. The vines wrapped around Ryan's legs and held him still. "Don't try and fight it, boy. I have many years of practice on you," the man said in a gruff tone, and I looked at what he was doing in shock. "Who are you?" Ryan yelled as he tried to lift his legs me. "I'm glad you asked. I'm the Earth Elemental, if you haven't noticed." He chuckled, but no one laughed. Ryan gave up trying to fight the vines. His head shot up and glanced at Tate's sudden movement. Tate had shifted back, and I don't know how, but wore on just a pair of dark jeans. "Give me one good reason why I shouldn't kill you," Tate asked, but I knew him better. Either way, he was willing to kill him. "I don't have one," Ryan said in a smug tone as he shrugged his shoulders. Ryan quickly raised his hands and shot out a massive fireball towards Tate. Tate was too fast and moved out of the way. However, the fireball grazed the side of his torso, making him drop to his knees. "Tate," I gasped as I ran over to him. But before I could, a wall of fire circled around Tate and I moved back. I raised my palms to drench it, but nothing happened. I tried again and looked down at my hands, confused. "Your hand might be as good as new, but you have to wait at least an hour to use them for your powers," Ryan said casually, and I growled at him. The man near me raised his hands angrily at Ryan. The vines began to wrap around his arms to stop him, but Ryan quickly burnt them and shot a fireball to the man. The Earth Elemental hissed as it caught his leg. I glanced over at Tate to see the flames were nearing him, and I began to panic. "Stop, Ryan, stop!" I screamed as I stood on the other side of the flames. Ryan grinned. "Say my name again," he said with a loud laugh. Tate growled loudly as Ryan freed himself and stalked towards me. I noticed Tate glance around him and brace himself. I quickly shook my head at him. "Don't even think about it," I said to him sadly now. Ryan said in a fed-up tone, "We can go now." I growled, and I felt something in the pit of my stomach. "Get rid of the flames," I demanded and pointed towards the fire around Tate. It was his turn to say no as he shook his head with an amused grin. No, he's gonna burn alive just like I did. Ryan paused with a malicious smile. Except he's going to die. He's gonna feel the pain and suffer. I began seeing red. The sensation in the pit of my stomach spread around my body like wildfire. No, I screamed and my eyes zeroed in on Ryan. Ryan's eyes widened and suddenly he too screamed. The flames around Tate vanished and Ryan clutched his stomach. My eyes didn't leave Ryan and the sensation I felt in my body was leaving me in waves and was directed at Ryan. Ryan screamed loudly and began coughing violently. I felt like I was in a trance and couldn't move a muscle, even when Tate appeared and stood by my side. I couldn't even blink but only stare Ryan down. I knew I was causing Ryan the pain, but I couldn't control it. Stop! Ryan gasped as he fell onto his knees, in new fits of coughs. Suddenly he made choking noises. That's when he began choking up water and the earth elemental looked at me in shock. Stop, I said, taking a step forward. Stop, what this? I felt another wave of energy leave me. That's when the water Ryan was coughing up turned into blood. He clawed at his throat and fell to the ground withering in pain. And then he went limp. The energy I was feeling came rushing back like a slap in the face and I stumbled back. Alina, Tate whispered as he held my face in his hands looking at me in concern. What the hell did I just do? I whispered back as I looked at Ryan's body with wide eyes. The earth elemental walked over to Ryan and examined him. Well, you seem to have drained him of both water and blood. 𝐿𝐲𝐳. I stared down at the limp body in shock. My mouth was open ajar and my eyes were as wide as saucers. How is that possible? I gasped as the earth elemental leaned back up and looked over at me. There is plenty of water in the human body. You tell me, he said with a small grin while I stared at him in shock. He was standing near a dead body and was seriously grinning at me. Tate stepped forward and wrapped his arms around me, pulling me back into his chest as he gave the earth elemental a skeptical look. Why are you here? Tate asked calmly as he shielded me away from Ryan's body. Me? Would you believe me if I said elementals attract one another? The earth elemental stated with an eyebrow raised. I glanced up at Tate with a confused look that we both seemed to share. The earth elemental rolled his eyes and sighed as he looked at our questioning gaze. Basically, all the elementals will eventually meet in their lifetime. Think of it as nature's force, he said with a shrug. I sighed and my shoulders sagged. This meant that we still had the air elemental to meet. Great, let's just hope he or she doesn't turn out like Ryan. You know this? How? Tate asked curiously, his stance on alert as he held me tightly in his arms. I'm a middle-aged man. I've lived longer and done my research, he replied with a friendly smile. To be honest, he seemed quite healthy for a middle-aged man. He had dark brown hair and bright green eyes. Wrinkles were near his eyes, suggesting he smiled a lot in the past. Do you need a place to stay? I blurted out without thinking and the man raised an eyebrow at me. Alina. I felt Tate squeeze my arm in warning, but I ignored it. I felt like I could trust the man and he had saved our lives. Surely that's a good enough reason. How kind of you to offer, he said, looking directly at me with a smile, and then his gaze wandered to Tate's. His smile only widened and he let out a small chuckle looking directly at Tate. Though I'll pass. I glanced at Tate, who stared at the earth elemental with narrowed eyes. I glared at Tate and slapped his chest, making his gaze slowly drift to mine. No, really. We do stay in the werewolf committee and there's plenty of room, I insisted with a toothy smile. The man glanced between Tate and I with an amused look. Finally, he looked back at me and nodded his head. Great, I bellowed, and Tate let out a sigh as I put my hand into his and began walking, the earth elemental trailing behind us. I just killed a person, I stated with a pause as the situation came crushing down onto me like a ton of bricks. And here I am inviting visitors for tea. I muttered the last part with sarcasm. I felt bad for not feeling bad, though it's not like Ryan didn't deserve it, right? There's tea. The elemental perked up as he glanced at us. I'll deal with the body, Tate reassured, ignoring our comments as he urged me to walk. Tate wrapped his arm around my shoulders and pulled me close to his side, and I sighed in bliss. Make sure you don't burn the body. The earth elemental warned from behind, and Tate snorted. If only you knew. I whispered and glanced at Tate, who gave me a knowing look. We finally made it back to the committee and immediately walked in. We made our way to Tate's office. Tate opened the door and I was taken aback by the sudden noise. "Where the hell have you been?" Colin yelled as he narrowed his eyes at Tate and roughly pushed his chest. "I try mind linking you and you block me out." "What the hell, son?" Colin barked, and concern was evident in his eyes, making me feel a little guilty. Tate ignored him and shrugged him off as he walked around to his desk. Both Dale and Tom stood in the room with their arms crossed over their chest. "Brother, care to explain?" Dale asked in an impatient tone as he looked at Tate expectantly. "No," Tate replied gruffly, "the fire elemental's dead." A voice chimed in. I looked up, surprised to see the earth elemental. I felt slightly guilty as I had completely forgot he was in the room. Tom cleared his throat at the obvious intruder. Everyone stared at him in confusion. "You brought home a new friend?" Colin asked slowly as he lifted the cup in his hand to his mouth, his eyes not leaving the elemental. "𝐊𝐲𝐼𝐻 dead." Tom blurted out as he looked at us in shock. "Oh man, did we miss out on the action?" Dale whined as he slumped onto the sofa looking cross. "Water elemental over here. Drained him of both water and blood," the earth elemental said as he nodded his head at me with an impressed expression. "Drained?" Dale gulped. "Remind me never to go onto your bad side." He mumbled and took a step back. "But I thought you only controlled water. How could you possibly do that?" Tom stated in a confused tone as he looked at me with furrowed eyebrows. I looked at him with a clueless expression, shrugging my shoulders. If only I knew. What I did back there scared myself, and I did not want to be the next 𝐻𝐻𝐼𝐻 anytime soon. I could deal with my unnatural Percy Jackson powers, but making people choke on water and blood, that's a big no. No one answered me. "Who is this guy?" Colin asked as he tilted his cup in the direction of the earth elemental. He seemed uninterested in what Tom was saying and more curious on who the earth elemental was. "He's the earth elemental," Tate said in a casual tone, making it sound like he was talking about the weather. He motioned me over and I didn't object. As I shuffled my way over to him, Tate pulled me down onto his lap and wrapped his arms around me. That's when I noticed he was still shirtless and his bare chest was pressed against my back, making my throat go dry. "Oh boy, you're an elemental too?" Dale asked in shock as he stared at the earth elemental with his mouth open wide. "I am indeed," he replied smoothly and flashed Dale a confident smile. "Say," Colin mumbled as he gave the man a cautious look. "We didn't catch your name." "My apologies," he replied, glancing around at us. "My name is Joseph." He pressed with a pause. "Joseph 𝐊𝐲𝐻𝐼𝐻." Confused, I visibly froze and my mouth opened on its own accord. I felt Tate tense and his arms tighten around me. "𝐊𝐲𝐻𝐼𝐻," Dale repeated as he scratched his head. Why does that sound so familiar? Even in my shocked state, I couldn't help but roll my eyes at his stupidity. "Stupid," Colin mumbled, reading my thoughts exactly as he tilted his head back and drowned down his beverage. "Is there a problem?" Joseph asked as he glanced at our shocked states in confusion. I climbed off of Tate's lap and I slowly walked around the desk, my eyes never leaving Joseph's. Could we be related? I mean, it was possible. I grew up in foster care and never knew who my real parents or family were. I didn't let it bother me, so I never brought it up. "My name is Alina," I spoke, and Joseph looked over at me. "𝐊𝐲𝐻𝐼𝐻." This time it was his turn to be shocked. He looked at me for a second and realization flashed in his eyes. Not even a second later, I was tightly embraced in his arms. I stood there with my arms limply to my sides in complete confusion. I heard a growl and I was ripped away from Joseph, and Tate stood in front of me as he glared at Joseph. "What the hell?" Tate yelled as he pushed me onto his side, growling uncontrollably. I ignored Tate and moved away from him to stand in front of Joseph. "Do you know me?" I asked the middle-aged man, and a gentle smile reached his lips as he looked at me in a whole new light. "Your father is my cousin, of course I do," he bellowed, and I looked at him completely lost. "Jonathan is going to be ecstatic." I have to. Suddenly the wide smile on Joseph's face disappeared as he looked at me with a frown. "But you died, I mean when Julia gave birth to you." You were. He trailed of growing more confused by the second. Dead, I gulped, and he nodded his head. I grew up in foster care, I said, shaking my head. That's impossible. You must have me mixed up with someone else. No. Joseph cut in, shaking his head. Jonathan named you Alina before you were born. And you're an elemental just like me. It all makes sense. Joseph finished with a wide smile as he looked at me in awe. The whole room stayed silent, all eyes on me except. Tate said suddenly from behind me, "She's alive and didn't die." Tate roughly answered as he wrapped an arm around my waist. "So you're family." I blurted out, and Joseph looked at me with a sad smile. "If I am right, then yes, I am." I remained silent after that. Tate ordered everyone out of the room, except Joseph, who didn't take his eyes off me. I sat in the armchair opposite Tate, and Joseph sat on the one beside me. Tate was behind his desk as he looked back and forth from Joseph and I. "Speak," Tate demanded as he glued his hazel eyes onto Joseph. "Jonathan may be my cousin, but we grew up as brothers. Your mother, Julia." Joseph stopped talking as he gave me a sad smile. "She died when she gave birth to you. We were told she lost the baby, but..." Joseph trailed off as he looked at me in disbelief. I gave him a tight smile and glanced down at my lap. I fiddled with my fingers and let out a sigh. So my mother was dead. Sure, I felt sympathetic, but how could I be upset and grieve to a woman I never knew? "My dad," I whispered, looking up at Joseph. "Is he alive?" I asked, almost afraid of the answer. "Yes, I was with him just yesterday," Joseph exclaimed, and I felt myself slightly relax. I wasn't completely alone, I have to tell him. Your father grieved the loss of his wife and daughter every single day. Joseph told me with sad eyes as he looked over at Tate. "May I call the pack house?" he asked, gesturing to the phone, and Tate pushed it towards him. Joseph pressed numerous digits and then held the phone to his ear. My palms grew sweaty, and I glanced at Tate, who was already looking back at me. He must have sensed my mood or seen my anxiousness, because he leaned over and grabbed my hand, placing it into his warm ones as he gave it a squeeze. "Relax," he murmured, and I nodded my head hello. Joseph spoke into the receiver, and I gripped onto Tate's hand for dear life. "It's Joseph, put your alpha on the phone." Joseph spoke, and his eyes found mine as he gave me a gentle look and soft smile. However, when he said alpha, I glanced at Tate, who raised an eyebrow and looked at Joseph. Yes, I heard a gruff voice on the other line. Thanks to Werewolf hearing, and I held my breath. I immediately blocked out my ability of hearing the other line, afraid of what I would hear. "You're not going to believe it, Jonathan, Alina. She's alive," Joseph exclaimed in an excited voice. "I haven't mistaken anyone, she's sitting right here. Jonathan, come and see for yourself," he said, and looked at Tate, silently asking for permission. Tate clenched his jaw and stared back at Joseph. I cleared my throat, and Tate's head snapped to mine. I gave him a small nod, and Tate sighed as he nodded his head to Joseph. "If I had a father out there, I wouldn't mind meeting him. I lived 18 years without a family, so what harm could this possibly do? The Werewolf Committee, that's where." Joseph spoke, and then with a short bye hung up. "He'll be here tomorrow," Joseph whispered and stood up with a sigh. "I'll leave you two to talk." Joseph placed his hand on my shoulder and gave it a squeeze. He looked at me in adoration and slowly left the room. "Well," I said in a shaky tone once Joseph was gone, "things just keep getting interesting, don't they?" I continued with a small laugh. "Laugh it off for now, Alina. But this is anything but funny." Truth be told, I felt confused. My mind was a mess, and I felt completely out of control. I didn't know what to do or what to feel. "Hey," Tate cooed softly as he appeared beside me. "You're not alone, don't forget that," he said gently, and I stood up so he could embrace me. It's all just too much. First I find out I'm an elemental. Then I lose my best friend. Then Ryan makes a mess of things. I bellowed as I tightened my grip on Tate. "Now my dad, I'm so confused," I groaned. Things were just happening too fast. "In the end, it's gonna work out, I promise." Tate vowed, and I sighed. "I sure hope so." It was dark. The moon's usual light didn't slip through the curtains and flood my room. Today the moon made a no-show, and that left me to gaze up at the ceiling. Jonathan was coming tomorrow, my father. It felt beyond strange saying that. The word was unfamiliar with me, and I wasn't planning on getting used to it anytime soon. The nervousness I was feeling didn't allow me to get a blink of sleep. I didn't toss or turn, but simply laid in bed with my eyes wide open and every cell in my body still awake. Everything seemed like it was a mess. Only a few months ago, I had a fairly simple life where all I had to worry about was my homework and getting to class on time. But nowadays I've had to try and not get killed and reconnect with family. My mind was filled with thoughts, and it certainly kept me up. Alina. I immediately snapped out of my daydream as I saw Tate standing by my bed. I eyed him in confusion, considering I hadn't heard him walk in yet. I asked as I sat up, my back pressed against the headboard as I brought my knees to my chest. "You can't sleep," Tate all but stated as he stared at me intently, making my heart speed up. He wore simple dark trousers and a V-neck and still managed to look good. Just at the thought, I scooted over and patted the spot next to me on the bed. Tate was immediately by my side, and I sighed as his warm body cuddled with mine. I rested my head onto his shoulder, and Tate gently ran his hand through my hair, making my eyes flutter close. Even though the room was beyond dark, we both could see somewhat clearly. "I want this all to stop," I murmured with my eyes still closed, and I felt Tate's hand pause against my cheek. The motion was a silent gesture to explain what I meant. "The drama. I just want to be with my mate and be happy, not constantly worrying about who's trying to harm us next." I grumbled, and I heard Tate sigh as he continued to caress my hair. "I know you do. I'd love for nothing more to be with you and have no interruptions. One day, when this is all over, you will get the happiness you want." Tate's low voice soothed my worries instantly. I automatically believed his words, and my body relaxed against his. "Yeah," I agreed, trying to convince myself. "You're right," I said as a yawn escaped my lips. Suddenly, I was very tired, and Tate's warm arms wrapped around my figure. "Sleep," he softly ordered and kissed the top of my head. I nodded and clung onto Tate as I felt myself slowly drift off to sleep. I woke up the next morning to an empty bed. The sheets beside me were cold, probably meaning Tate must have gotten up really early. I hadn't forgot about my father's journey to the Werewolf committee today, so the mere thought made me groggily leave the bed. After freshening up, I got dressed up in simple clothing and left my room. I would have loved nothing more but to stay in my bed however guests were arriving. I left my room and made my way to the lobby, and before I could even step a foot in there, Tom suddenly appeared in front of me and signaled me to stop. "What is it?" I asked, confused, as Tom glanced behind him and back to me. "They're here. Are you sure you're ready?" he asked in a concerned voice, and I gave him a small smile with a nod. "Wait," I said as I tilted my head. "There. Who else is he bringing?" I asked as I slowly walked into the lobby. I spotted Colin and Tate by the door and made my way to them. They simply stood there silently, and I glanced around. "They're almost here," Tate bellowed as his hazel eyes stared down at me. Immediately, the nerves from last night began to form in the pit of my stomach, and I squirmed uncomfortably. I was pushed into a muscular chest, and I sighed at Tate's familiar warm arms. "They're here." Everything felt like it was in slow motion. The grand doors to the Werewolf committee opened gracefully, and in walked in 4 figures. 2 guards entered first with their chests puffed out. A man was behind them along with a woman in a white vest and tight bun. "Where is she?" the man commanded, and Joseph emerged from the corner. "Jonathan, this is she. Look," Joseph commented as he gave me a wide smile and urged me forward. Tate didn't allow it and held on to me tightly, but he stepped back slightly so I was on view to the others. My eyes were glued onto the man who stepped forward from the guards, and the nurse-looking women followed closely. My breath hitched in my throat as I looked at the powerful man in awe. To say we both looked alike would be an understatement. We had the same eyes, same dark hair, and same features. If someone were to put us side by side, you'd immediately know we were related. The man, my father, stared at me with the same expression of awe, and he took a step towards me. "Nina, the DNA test won't be needed. This is my daughter," Jonathan said with so much confidence as he didn't bother glancing at the nurse. His eyes solemnly focused on mine. "But Sir Alpha, we can never be sure." The woman in the white vest persisted in desperation, and my eyes narrowed towards the woman. "Who is she, and what does she want?" "Nonsense. You may be a nurse, but I am a father and an alpha. I know who my child is, Jonathan said for the first time with an easy smile. His eyes never left mine, and they held so much love and adoration I was surprised instantly. The whole time the rest of us remained silent, unsure of what to say, but of course me being the person I am. I cleared my throat and opened my mouth to speak. You all can stay for a while, right, even for dinner. So we could, I fiddled with my fingers. Get to know each other. Wow, was I acting awkward? There's a first. Yes, we will, Jonathan said in a demanding voice, and I felt Tate breath roughly through his nose. They both were alphas after all, the rest go. You don't need any more companies, Tate said in a smooth voice, and I saw the smirk tugging onto the corner of Colin's mouth. Jonathan nodded and signaled to his guards to leave. They both bowed and obediently made a move to leave. However, the nurse didn't move a muscle and began shaking her head in desperation, making the two guards stop and look at her questionably. No, this can't be her. She can't be alive. She's dead. I was there. The nurse suddenly cried out, and we looked at her. Stunned. Nina, I said leave, Jonathan said in an impatient tone as he looked at the nurse in confusion. She should be dead. I couldn't kill her, but they should have, she yelled, and Tate began growling as he pulled me backwards, making me slam into his chest. What is this woman saying? He growled, and I watched with wide eyes as I tried to sink further into Tate. Elementals, their power is inhumane, she bit out in a ragged breath. Killing the water elemental kills them all, and she, the nurse snapped as her finger flew out to point at me, should be dead enough, Tate yelled, and uncontrollable growls emerged from his chest after one another. I want her out, Jonathan barked, joining in. His two guards hurried over and grabbed the woman from both sides. They are dangerous, she managed to scream right before she was dragged out of view. Tate was shaking very badly, and I looked up to see his eyes darken. Shoo, I cooed as I cupped his face in my hands. Tate, look at me, Tate, I gently said. Once Tate's eyes found mine, his growl slowly died down. He sighed, closing his eyes as he shook his head. Once he opened his eyes, the beautiful hazel orbs stared back at me. I apologized for Nina's actions, though her words. I will get to the bottom of that. Jonathan looked at me with furrowed eyebrows. His eyes held so much sadness, and his posture wasn't as confident. But you're alive, that's all that matters. That's all your mother wanted. I nodded my head and gave him a smile. When he spotted my smile, Jonathan let out a relieved sigh and walked over to me. Tate slowly let me go and allowed me some space. By now, the others fled the room, leaving the three of us. Not even a second later, I was crushed into a chest. Warm's arms held me close. I breathed in the new scent, savoring it. A father's scent. Tate remained silent. You're alive, Jonathan whispered. You really are. 18 years earlier, Colin's POV silence. The only noise heard was the constant ticking of the clock. I stood leaning on the wall, beverage in hand. Michael stood across me, staring intently at the wall, and Richard bit his nails impatiently. How long does it bloody take to give birth? Richard growled as he abruptly stood up from his chair and paced the room. How do we even know Julia's kid is the water elemental? Michael asked in a bored tone as he glanced over at us. Simple, we don't, I chimed in amusement as I grinned at the pair, though. I added with a smirk, if Nina says she's got her calculations right, then she has. You're right, Michael's gruff voice called out. She's never wrong. We stood in the forgotten surgery room waiting for the baby to arrive. The boys were impatient and wanted the job over and done with. I, on the other hand, had all the time in the world. If the water elemental dies, they all die, Richard said in a low voice as a small smile spread across his face. Exactly, I cooed, that's why we must be patient. Remember, elementals are dangerous. They need to be killed, I repeated like many times before with a wide smile. Richard and Michael shared devious glances and became a little more patient. As if on cue, the door slammed open and in rushed Nina with a small baby cradled in her arms. She quickly closed the door and shoved the little child wrapped in blankets out towards us. Take it, I can't bear to look at it, Nina snapped as she thrust the baby in Michael's arms. Guilt, I mused, and Nina looked at me in disgust. No, not guilt, disgrace, Nina said, sneaking a glance at the baby. I knew she was lying. She felt guilty for what she was doing, but at the same time believed elementals were inhumane and needed to be killed. Sure, I smirked, leave it to us. Nina gave me a short nod and rushed out of the doors. However, before she got to fast, she turned around to face us. Make it quick before it bloody wakes up. Before she wakes up, or so she doesn't feel much pain. I couldn't help but think as I rolled my eyes. It's tiny. Richard whispered, looking surprised as he peered at the sleeping baby over Michael's shoulder. And harmless, yes, for now it is, Michael said coldly as he pushed the baby into Richard's arms. Richard stumbled slightly and glared at Michael as he placed the baby on the bed in the corner of the room. Right, let's get rid of it. Richard spat in disgust as he picked up a knife from the sink near the bed. I leaned off the wall and slammed my glass cup down onto the desk near me and walked over to the baby. We can't leave blood as evidence, idiot. Give me the damn thing. I snapped as I snatched the knife from him and tossed it away. Leave it to me. Richard willingly backed away, and so did Michael. Are you sure you can do it? Richard asked me, and I snorted, it's Colin. Of course he can, Michael said with confidence, and I gave him a grin. I picked up the baby and cradled it in my arms. I walked over to the back of the room where the door was. Behind it was a morgue where dead bodies were cleaned. Where are you going? Michael asked as he slowly walked into the middle of the room. Oh, did you want to watch? I asked with a wide smile as I paused to look back at him. Michael grimaced and shook his head as he went back near Richard. Thought so, opening the door. I entered the room and closed it behind me. I walked over to the table in the middle and slowly placed the baby onto it. I moved the blankets away from her face, and only a second later the child's eyes began to open. Green orbs curiously stared up at me, and a small smile spread my lips. Hello, Alina, I whispered, not wasting another second. I re-wrapped the baby and picked it up. Walking over to the surgery table, I moved it aside, and I was greeted by a brick wall. Slowly pulling apart the bricks with one hand. I stopped when there was enough room for me to squeeze through with the baby. Using my werewolf strength and speed, I made it out of the building in just a few seconds. No, I didn't want the baby dead. If I took her back to her parents, she would be killed and in danger. I couldn't risk that. I was going to leave her on the doorsteps of foster care. Yes, that way no one will ever know. I couldn't have the water elemental dead. Having her dead would have all the other elementals dead. As the air elemental, I couldn't have that.